The presentation folder landed on the table with a sound like a gavel. "You're not on the program," said the woman in the charcoal blazer. Not a question. A verdict. Across the room, near the window that overlooked 42 floors of downtown Chicago, a man Elena had never met was watching her. Not the folder, not the other women at the table. Her. And not in the way men usually watched women at events like this, with that particular quality of attention that is really just assessment wearing a polite expression. He was watching the way a person watches something they haven't decided what to do with yet. Elena didn't look back. She had learned a long time ago that looking back too soon gave away information she hadn't chosen to give. The city burned orange outside the glass. She picked up the folder and set it back down, squaring the corners with 2 fingers, and said nothing. The night had barely started. 48 hours earlier. The invitation had come through her sister. That was the first thing Elena Marsh should have understood. The first signal she had ignored, or chosen not to read too carefully, because reading it carefully would have required her to do something about it. And she had been very tired that month of doing things about things. Diane had called on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. Diane called on Sunday mornings when she had nothing specific to say, and on Thursday nights when she wanted something specific, and the rhythm of those calls had been so consistent for so many years that Elena had learned to read the day of the week the way a sailor reads weather. A Tuesday call meant something was off schedule. Something was being introduced carefully. "The Hartwell launch," Diane said, after the preliminary minutes of conversation about their mother's new physical therapist and a plumbing situation in Diane's building. "You've heard of it." It was not a question, because both of them knew Elena had heard of it. Everyone in architectural design within a 400-mile radius of Chicago had heard of the Hartwell Foundation launch. Carter Hartwell had spent 11 years building a real estate portfolio that had quietly become one of the most significant in the Midwest. And now he was launching a design initiative, a curated program that would commission emerging and mid-career designers for projects across 6 cities. The kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. The kind of event where being in the room mattered almost as much as anything you said once you were in it. "I've heard of it," Elena said. "Margaret has 2 extra invitations," Diane said. "She thought of you." The thing about Diane and Margaret, Diane was 34, Margaret was 36, and Elena was 31, was that they had learned very early the particular power of the favor that comes with a hidden cost. Their mother had not taught them this deliberately. She had simply been a woman who believed that kindness and transaction were not opposites, who had built her social life on a careful economy of debts and repayments, and her daughters had absorbed this the way children absorb everything important, not through instruction, but through observation. Elena had learned it too. She had simply decided not to use it. "That's generous of Margaret," Elena said. "She has conditions." Diane said this without pause, which meant she had been prepared for Elena to ask, which meant the conditions were the point. "She wants you to present some of your current work, as a favor. The new mixed-use concepts you've been developing for the Norwood project. That work isn't ready. She says Carter Hartwell is looking for exactly that kind of urban residential integration. It would be good for you, Elena." Elena set down the mug she had been holding. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window she could see the lights of the building across the alley, 2 windows with the warm yellow of someone cooking, one with the blue pulse of a television. The Norwood concepts were 18 months of work. They were the most original thing she had done in years, and they were not ready because she had not finished them. And she had not finished them because finishing them felt irreversible in a way that the incompleteness did not. Once they existed fully, they could be judged fully. While they were still becoming, they were still protected. "I'll think about it," Elena said. She said yes on Thursday. Not because Diane called again. Diane didn't, which was its own kind of pressure. But because Elena spent Wednesday night sitting at her drafting table, looking at the Norwood sketches, and thinking about the difference between protecting something and holding it hostage. She emailed Margaret on Thursday morning. Margaret replied within 4 minutes, which told Elena everything she needed to know about how long the reply had been waiting to be sent. The portfolio Elena brought to the Hartwell launch was printed at a shop in Wicker Park on a Friday afternoon, 48 hours after she had said yes and 6 hours before the event. She had spent Wednesday night and most of Thursday refining 3 of the Norwood concepts into presentation-ready form. Not all 18 months of work, which could not be compressed into a folder, but 3 sequences of drawings that captured the essential logic of the project. The way she had thought about vertical residential space not as stacked floors, but as interconnected neighborhoods, each with its own rhythm, each borrowing light and air and movement from the others in ways that the external facade would never suggest. It was good work. She knew it was good work with the particular certainty that has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with having spent enough time with something to understand exactly what it is. She arrived at the Hartwell event at 7:12, which was deliberately not the earliest she could have arrived. The venue was a renovated industrial building in the West Loop that a firm Elena admired had converted 5 years ago. The bones of the original structure still visible in the ceiling beams. The new materials chosen to converse with them rather than compete. She noticed this the way she noticed all spaces, not as a thought exactly, but as a physical registration, the way musicians hear pitch in ambient sound. The event was already thick with people. The design world in Chicago was not enormous, which meant that a room like this contained everyone who mattered in it and everyone who was trying to matter in it. And the difference between those two groups was almost always visible if you knew what to look for. The people who mattered moved through rooms at a certain pace, unhurried, not because they had no purpose, but because they did not need to signal purpose. The people trying to matter moved faster, changed direction more, kept their eyes at a slightly different height. Elena moved at her own pace, which was the pace of someone who had not yet decided what she was. She found Margaret near the bar. Margaret Marsh was 36, and had been beautiful in a way that photographed well since she was 17, which had given her a relationship with rooms that Elena had watched carefully their entire shared life. Margaret moved through public spaces with the ease of someone who had never had to wonder how she would be received, which made her genuinely kind in some ways and genuinely careless in others, often without being able to tell the difference. "You made it," Margaret said, and her smile was the warm one, which Elena had learned to recognize as the smile that preceded a complication. "I made it." Elena set her portfolio on the table beside her. "Where do I present?" "That's actually—" Margaret touched her arm. "There's been a small change." This was the moment Elena had not let herself anticipate, which meant she had anticipated it so completely that her body had already prepared its response before her mind processed the words. Her shoulders stayed level. Her hands stayed still. "What kind of change?" she said. "The program is fuller than expected. Carter's people added 3 additional presentations this afternoon, and—" Margaret's expression arranged itself into something that was simultaneously apologetic and slightly absent, the way an expression looks when the emotion behind it is not quite the one being performed. "There isn't a slot for yours, technically, but you're on the list. You're in the room. You told me I was presenting. You can still make connections. Being here is half of it, honestly." Elena looked at her sister. Margaret looked back with the patient sincerity of someone who believes what she is saying because believing it is more comfortable than the alternative. Behind Margaret, across the room, Diane had appeared from somewhere with a glass of white wine, and was watching them with the expression of someone who already knows the ending of a scene. Elena picked up her portfolio. "All right," she said. She said it the way she said most things that required her to process something while appearing not to need to. Quietly, simply, without the additional word that would have told Margaret what she was actually thinking. Let the fact speak for itself. Let the silence after it carry what the voice would have made too visible. She moved away from the bar toward the main floor of the venue. The room was full of the specific energy of professional ambition, dressed as social ease, and Elena moved through it with the practice of someone who had spent years attending events where she was adjacent to the point rather than the point itself. She had been Diane's younger sister at architecture school events. She had been the junior associate at firm mixers where the partners collected the attention. She had been the woman without a business card at the networking cocktail parties where business cards were the entire language. She had learned that invisibility in a room like this was not the same as absence. Invisibility meant you could observe without being observed. Invisibility meant no one was performing for you, which meant you could see the unperformed version of every person in the space. She got a glass of water from a passing tray and positioned herself near the east wall, beside a display of architectural models from previous Hartwell-funded projects. The models were beautiful, tight, precise, the kind of work that reminded her why she had chosen this field before the field had a chance to be disappointing. A woman nearby stumbled. It was the kind of stumble that happens in heels on polished concrete. Not dramatic, not a fall, but the particular moment when a foot catches the edge of a floor transition and the body performs a rapid involuntary calculation about whether this is going to go badly. The woman was carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and a folder of prints under the other arm, and the calculation was going to go badly. Elena was already moving. She caught the folder before it hit the floor. The laptop bag swung hard but stayed on the shoulder, and steadied the woman's elbow with her other hand. The whole thing took about 2 seconds, and happened beside an architectural model of a community library that neither of them touched. "Oh, God," the woman said. Her name tag said, "Ruth Okafor, Hartwell Foundation." "Thank you." The transition strip between the tile sections. "It's not flush," Elena said. She crouched briefly and looked at it. A millimeter gap where the installer had not quite aligned the threshold strip. "Tell facilities before the end of the night. Someone's going to catch it worse." Ruth Okafor looked at her. Not with the automatic gratitude of someone who has just been steadied. With the particular look of someone registering a person for the first time as a full thing, rather than as an element of background. "I will," Ruth said. "Thank you. Genuinely." "Keep the folder flat," Elena told her. "The prints will curl at the corners otherwise." Ruth Okafor gave her a small, real smile and moved toward the facilities desk. Elena straightened and turned back to the models. She did not see the man who had been standing 12 feet away, on the other side of the library model, holding a glass of water and watching the whole exchange with the quality of attention he usually reserved for spaces he was trying to understand before deciding whether they were worth understanding. Carter Hartwell was not in the room yet. This was information that circulated through the venue in the particular way that information about the most important person at any event always circulates. Not as an announcement, not as a visible search, but as a subtle recalibration of everyone's positioning. People who had been facing one direction angled slightly toward the entrance. People who had been in the middle of conversations maintained the conversation while developing a new peripheral awareness. The room was doing what rooms at events like this always do when the central reason for the room's existence has not yet appeared. It was waiting while pretending not to wait. Elena was looking at a model of an adaptive reuse project, a former rail maintenance building converted into a mixed-income residential complex in Indianapolis, and thinking about the window proportions. They had preserved the original clear-story glazing on the north facade, but scaled the new residential windows differently on the south, which created an interesting tension between the two systems that worked better in the model than she expected it might work at full scale. She was trying to decide whether this was a problem or a solution when she became aware that someone had stopped near her. Not the stopping of someone waiting to get past, the stopping of someone who has chosen to stop. She didn't turn immediately. This was not strategy, or not only strategy. It was the habit of someone who had learned that reactions given too quickly were reactions given for someone else's benefit. "The window scaling bothers you," said a voice. She turned then. The man was perhaps 38, with the particular kind of face that is not conventionally remarkable until you notice that every feature in it is doing something specific. Nothing decorative, nothing wasted. He was wearing a jacket that was well made without advertising the fact. His glass of water was still full, which meant he had been holding it for a while and had not been drinking it, which meant he had been using it the way some people use objects at events. Something to hold, so the hands have a purpose, so the body doesn't signal that it's only observing. He was looking at the model. "The south elevation," Elena said. "The residential window heights don't match the structural rhythm of the original frame. It works at this scale. I'm not sure it works at 8 stories." "It doesn't," he said. "There are photos from the completion. The south face reads as 2 buildings that agreed not to fight each other rather than 1 building that knows what it is." Elena looked at him properly then. "You've seen the completed project." "I funded part of it." He set his water glass on the narrow ledge beside the display. "Daniel Hartwell, Carter's brother. I handled the operational side." The name recalibrated the room in the small way that names sometimes do. Not seismically, but enough that Elena felt the air around the conversation adjust slightly. "Elena Marsh," she said. "I know." He said it without any particular emphasis, which made it more interesting than if he had said it with emphasis. "You caught Ruth's folder." "She caught herself," Elena said. "I just reduced the variables." Something in his expression shifted. Not a smile exactly. More the precursor to a smile. The thing that happens in a face when it has registered something it intends to return to. "Are you presenting tonight?" he asked. The pause before she answered was not long, maybe a second and a half, but she was aware of it. "I was scheduled to," she said. The program filled. He watched her say this without helping her say it. Some people, when they're listening to information that contains difficulty, fill the difficulty with expressions of sympathy or sounds of acknowledgement, small verbal gestures that tell you they are listening, but also smooth over the rougher texture of what's being said. Daniel Hartwell did neither. He listened the way certain architects look at buildings, with complete attention and without editorializing. "What were you presenting?" he asked. "Mixed-use vertical residential. Urban neighborhood integration." She paused. "It's a concept series I've been developing for about 18 months. Do you have it with you?" She glanced at the portfolio leaning against the wall behind her. He followed her glance. "May I?" he asked. "It's not finished," she said. This was true, and it was also the easiest true thing to say in a situation where the real thing was more complicated. That showing it to someone significant before she was ready felt like a particular kind of exposure she had been protecting herself from for reasons she hadn't fully named. "The Indianapolis project wasn't finished when Carter funded it," Daniel said. He wasn't pushing. He was offering her a fact, and letting her decide what to do with it. She picked up the portfolio and handed it to him. He opened it with the attention of someone who knows how to look at design work. Not flipping, not scanning, but reading each page at the pace the work required. She watched him look at it and felt the particular vulnerability of that, the sensation of standing in a room while someone reads a thing that contains your thinking, that makes your thinking visible in a way that conversation never quite does. The room shifted around them. 3 feet away, 2 women were discussing a renovation project in Milwaukee. Near the bar, Diane had found someone she knew from a firm in the Gold Coast and was engaged in the animated version of herself that she deployed at professional events. Louder, more gestural, slightly more certain. Elena noticed all of this in the periphery, while her main attention stayed on Daniel Hartwell's hands and where they were in the portfolio. He reached the 3rd sequence, the one she had spent the most time on, the light study, the way different floor levels would interact with natural light across different seasons. He stopped there longer than he had stopped anywhere else. The light logic, he said. Not to her exactly, more as if noting something aloud. The floors aren't just stacked, she said. Each one borrows from the ones around it. The 3rd floor has this notch in the northwest corner that lets winter afternoon light reach the community space on 2. You'd lose rentable square footage. About 40 square feet. In exchange for? Residents who want to live on the 2nd floor because the light is good, she said, which affects turnover rates, which affects long-term revenue in ways that 40 square feet of additional unit space doesn't. He looked up from the portfolio. The quality of his attention had changed in a way she couldn't have described precisely, but could feel distinctly. It had become more specific, the way a room feels different when someone in it has decided something. This is good work, he said. I know, she said. He paused. Then something that was definitely a smile happened in his face, brief and real, the kind that comes from surprise at something that turns out to be unexpectedly honest. He handed the portfolio back and was about to say something when the room changed. Carter Hartwell had arrived. The shift in energy was immediate and collective, not loud, just present, the way gravity is present, felt rather than observed. He was taller than Daniel, with the kind of public ease that comes from years of being the most important person in rooms, the ease that looks like confidence, but is actually just familiarity with being watched. He moved through the space, greeting people with the practiced warmth of someone who has made warmth into a professional skill. Diane saw him. Elena watched her sister see him. The almost imperceptible straightening of posture, the recalibration of expression toward its most appealing configuration. Elena had watched Diane do this her entire life, in different rooms with different people, and she had never been able to decide whether it was calculation or simply what happened naturally when you moved through the world expecting to be chosen. Margaret appeared at Carter Hartwell's elbow within 45 seconds of his entering the room. This was not an accident. Margaret had positioned herself for exactly this. And then Margaret looked across the room and found Elena. The look lasted 2 seconds. It contained something Elena recognized. Not triumph exactly, because Margaret's version of this was always dressed in something warmer. More like satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who has arranged things and is watching the arrangement hold. Elena understood, in that moment, what she had not let herself understand fully when Diane called on Tuesday. The invitation had never been about generosity. The portfolio presentation slot had never existed. Or, if it had been removed deliberately, with the specific intent of placing Elena in a room where she would be present, but not visible, adjacent to an opportunity without access to it, available to witness the moment when Margaret and Diane positioned themselves in front of Carter Hartwell with the clear field of vision that Elena's presence in the background would, in some subtle way, help create. She had been brought here to be a comparison, to be the before in someone else's story. She held this knowledge very quietly. Daniel Hartwell was watching his brother work the room. He had the expression of someone who has watched a performance many times and finds it neither unpleasant nor particularly interesting. "He's good at that," Elena said. Daniel glanced at her. "At what?" "At being the most important person in a room without making the room feel like it's about him being important. He's been practicing since we were teenagers." There was affection in it, and something else, the complex warmth of knowing someone completely. Across the room, Margaret had caught Carter Hartwell's attention and was beginning what appeared to be a presentation of herself, the social equivalent of the architecture portfolio Elena was holding under her arm. Elena watched this for a moment, then turned back to the model display. She was still thinking about the window proportions on the south facade. The evening continued around her. Presentations were made. A residential firm from Logan Square, a landscape architecture practice from Evanston, two solo designers she recognized from their published work. The work was varied. Some of it was excellent. She listened to each one with real attention because the work deserved it regardless of what was happening around it. Daniel had moved away to speak with someone from the foundation. She saw him across the room twice, once in conversation with a man she didn't recognize, once standing alone near the windows, doing that thing again with the full glass of water. At 9:15, the formal program ended, and the room shifted into its denser, louder, less structured second mode, the part of events like this that is actually when most of the important things happen, because the removal of structure removes the performance requirements and people become slightly more themselves. Diane found Elena near the drinks table. "You're surviving," Diane said. She made it sound kind. "I'm fine," Elena said. "The program thing was always the plan," Elena said. She kept her voice even. "I know, Diane." A beat. Diane's expression did something complicated. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. The expression of someone who had expected a different conversation and is recalibrating. "She wanted you to be here," Diane said. "She thought Carter might still—" "I know what she thought." Something landed in the air between them. Not anger. Anger would have been easier for both of them. Something more like an old reckoning that neither of them had enough energy for tonight. "I'll talk to Margaret," Diane said finally. "You don't need to." "Elena." "Diane." She said her sister's name with the gentleness that meant the conversation was over, and Diane, who knew her well enough to hear it, let it be over. Elena turned back to the room. Across the space, standing beside the window display with his water glass, finally empty, Daniel Hartwell was watching her. Not the way you watch something at a distance. The way you watch something when you have already made a decision and are simply waiting to see if the decision is right. He crossed the room. He crossed the room in the manner of someone who has decided to cross a room, which sounds obvious until you have spent enough time at events like this to understand that most people in a room like this cross it with an audience in mind. They choose routes that pass the right people, that create the right chances for eye contact, that allow them to be seen moving towards someone important. Daniel Hartwell crossed it at an angle that was simply the most direct line between where he was and where she was. Nothing performed about it. "Your sister," he said when he reached her, "has been explaining to my brother how her firm's approach to residential design aligns perfectly with the Foundation's vision for community-centered development." Elena looked across the room, where Margaret was still engaged in conversation with Carter. From this angle and distance, she could see the precise level of attention Carter was deploying. Warm, present, professional, The level he would give to someone he was being polite to rather than someone he was genuinely interested in. "Is it working?" Elena asked. "He's been checking his watch twice in the last 4 minutes," Daniel said. "He's good at hiding it. But you notice. I've known him for 38 years. Elena almost smiled. She caught it before it was fully formed. Not because she was suppressing it, but because it arrived with something else attached. Something that made her want to give it space, rather than express it immediately. "What happened tonight?" Daniel said. "With the program?" "It was fine." He waited. He had a way of waiting that was not impatient and not pressuring, simply present, as if he had no particular investment in whether she continued or didn't, which somehow made continuing easier than not continuing. "My sisters arranged it," Elena said. "The invitation, the presentation slot that wasn't a slot. They wanted me here as, I think the word is context. Something to make another thing look better by comparison." She said this with the tone she had learned to use for facts about her family. Plainly, without the weight of feeling that the facts actually carried. Because the weight of feeling was hers, and she had not decided to give it to anyone in this room. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "The Norwood concepts," he said. "The light logic and the neighborhood stacking." He paused. "I want Carter to see them." Elena turned to look at him fully. "The presentation slot is over, yes. The program is done." He was not apologizing for this fact, simply acknowledging it. "But Carter stays until the room clears. He always does. And I can have a conversation with my brother that isn't a presentation. A conversation that happens to include your portfolio." The portfolio was still under her arm. She was aware of it. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because the work is good. I told you that. You also don't know me." "I know what I saw in the last 2 hours," he said. "The threshold strip you told Ruth to report. The way you looked at the Indianapolis model. The fact that you told me you knew your work was good and didn't apologize for it." He paused. "I know what the work is. That's generally the part that matters." Elena stood with this for a moment. Outside the tall windows, Chicago was performing its nighttime version of itself. The lake invisible in the dark. The lights of the skyline reflecting in the glass. The whole city going about its enormous, indifferent, continuous life. She thought about the difference between being maneuvered into a room for someone else's purpose and finding a purpose of her own once you were already there. She thought about 18 months of work and what it would mean to let it be seen. "All right," she said. "One condition." He waited. "You introduce me as a designer whose work you found interesting, not as someone who needs an introduction." She held his gaze. "I'll do the rest myself." Something in his face, that thing that was the precursor to a smile, arrived again. This time it stayed a moment longer before it left. "I can do that," he said. They moved toward the window where Carter Hartwell had migrated, where the density of people had thinned as the event settled into its late evening register. The city was fully dark now outside the glass, and the combination of the floor-to-ceiling windows and the light inside the room made everyone near the window visible against the darkness in a way that felt slightly more exposed than the rest of the space. Diane saw her moving. Elena felt rather than saw the exact moment her sister registered what was happening, the direction she was moving, the person she was moving with, the portfolio she was carrying. She did not look at Diane to confirm it. She knew what she would see. The rapid recalculation, the reassessment of variables, the expression adjusting to accommodate information that didn't fit the evening's plan. She kept walking, Margaret noticed 2 seconds later, from the other side of Carter Hartwell's immediate radius. The warm smile she had been deploying became briefly, invisibly tighter at the corners before it reset itself. Margaret was very good at resetting. She always had been. "Carter," Daniel said when they reached him, "I'd like you to meet Elena Marsh. I've been looking at her work tonight, and I think you should see it." Carter Hartwell turned from the conversation he had been having, with a genuine politician's ease, the kind that makes whoever he's turning toward feel like the conversation he was in before was merely preliminary, and extended his hand. "Daniel has good taste," he said. "Usually on the third or fourth thing. He's slow to commit." "It was the second thing," Daniel said. Carter looked at Elena with that quality of attention she had seen him give to everyone in the room. Full, warm, practiced, the opening move in a particular kind of conversation. Then something shifted in it slightly. The way the quality of attention shifts when the practiced layer meets something that doesn't quite fit what the practice was designed for. "What's the work?" he said. Elena opened the portfolio. Carter Hartwell looked at the first sequence for approximately 45 seconds. Elena had learned, from years of presenting work to people who made decisions about work, to read the quality of a silence. There is the silence of someone who is processing and intends to say something. There is the silence of someone who has processed and is deciding how to say the thing they have already decided. There is the silence of someone who is waiting for the presentation to be over so they can say the polite thing. Carter Hartwell's silence was none of these. It was the silence of someone who has encountered something unexpected and is taking the time to understand why it's unexpected before responding to it. Daniel stood slightly to the left of Elena, not involved in the presentation, simply present, which she was aware of in the way you are aware of a structure that is load-bearing without drawing attention to itself. "Walk me through the second sequence," Carter said. She did. She moved through the light study, the floor relationship logic, the community space notch on the northwest corner. She used the language she used when she was thinking clearly rather than performing. Specific, direct, willing to say, "I don't know yet," about the things she didn't know yet. "The 40 square feet, Carter said. "Your answer to Daniel about the revenue implication of losing rentable space." She paused. Daniel had told him. This meant Daniel had been paying attention during their earlier conversation to a degree that she hadn't fully registered in the moment. Had retained the specific number, the specific argument. 40 square feet in exchange for residents who stay, she said. Turnover is the variable most residential developers don't price accurately. They calculate it as a cost, not as a revenue question. The light notch changes the desirability of the second floor enough to reduce turnover by an estimated 18 to 20%. Estimated. I'd want 18 months of occupancy data from one completed building before I committed to the number. But the logic is sound, and the analogous data from natural light studies in residential development supports it. Carter looked at the third sequence. Margaret had entered Elena's peripheral vision. She was perhaps 15 feet away, engaged in a conversation of her own, but at an angle that could not be maintained comfortably without hearing at least part of this one. Elena did not look at her directly. "What does the building look like from the street?" Carter asked. This was the question she hadn't figured out yet. The honest answer was that she had 3 exterior options, and she wasn't sure which one was right. And 2 of them were bad in ways she could articulate, and 1 of them was wrong in a way she couldn't articulate yet. "I have 3 approaches," she said. 2 I've eliminated. 1 I'm still working. Show me the 2 you've eliminated. She found them in the back of the portfolio. Rough sketches, not presentation quality, the kind of drawings that existed to think rather than to show. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "They're rough," she said. "Good," he said. "The finished things tell me what you decided. The rough things tell me how you think." She showed him. He looked at them for a long time. Long enough that the conversation he had been extracted from had reformed elsewhere, that Daniel had shifted his weight slightly, that from across the room Elena could feel rather than see the adjustment happening in her sisters' respective positions, the subtle repositioning of people who are recalibrating a situation they thought they had control of. "The second sketch," Carter said, "the one with the angled setback on the third floor. What was wrong with it?" "The setback reads as apologetic," Elena said, "like the building is trying to make itself smaller to accommodate the street. The neighborhood this would be in doesn't need the building to be smaller. It needs the building to have a reason for its height." Carter looked at her. "What does a reason for its height mean in practice?" "It means the upper floors do something the ground level can't do. Not just residences. A function that requires the vantage point, that earns the height from the perspective of the people below it, as well as the people in it." Silence. "That's the thing you haven't solved yet," he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, made with the tone of someone who knows the difference between an unsolved problem and an absence of thinking. "Yes," she said. He closed the portfolio and handed it back to her. 18 months, he said. "Yes." "What will it take to get to a complete concept? Timeline? Resources?" Something altered in the air of the conversation. Elena registered it. The shift from assessment to something that was not yet commitment, but was adjacent to it. The shift that happens when a question changes from "what is this?" to "what would it take?" 6 months with proper resourcing, she said. A structural engineer on retainer from month 3, when the exterior logic needs to be tested against real load requirements. Access to one built project comparable in scale, so I can test the light theory against occupancy data that already exists. "Indianapolis," Daniel said, from his position slightly to her left. "Indianapolis," she agreed, and looked at him briefly, and looked away. Carter was watching this exchange. The quality of his attention had shifted again. Broader now, taking in more than just the portfolio, registering the geometry of the conversation, the 3 people in it. "Give me a card," he said to Elena. "I'll have someone from the foundation reach out next week." Elena did not have a business card. She had forgotten them at her apartment, which was the kind of thing that happens when you spend the 2 days before an event refining the work rather than preparing the logistics of attending. She felt the absence of the card with particular acuteness in this moment. She did not apologize for it. "I don't have one on me," she said, "but Ruth Okafor has my contact from the registration. Your foundation's registration." She paused. "The woman with the laptop bag, near the Indianapolis model. She'll have it." Something crossed Carter Hartwell's face. Quick, genuine, the closest thing to unguarded she had seen from him tonight. Then he smiled, and for the first time the smile was not entirely professional. "You're the one who told her about the floor strip," he said. "The threshold wasn't flush. Someone was going to catch it worse." He looked at his brother. Daniel looked back at him with an expression that was completely neutral, which, between people who had known each other for 38 years, probably communicated a great deal. "Next week," Carter said to Elena, "we'll be in touch." He moved away. The room continued. The city continued outside the glass. Elena stood with her portfolio under her arm and let the moment be what it was. Not more, not decorated, not interpreted yet. Just a fact that existed now alongside the other facts of the evening. She became aware, after a moment, that Diane was standing nearby. Not beside her, a few feet off, at the angle people stand when they're not yet committing to an approach. Diane's expression was doing several things at once, which was unusual for Diane, whose expressions were typically more edited. "Elena," she said. "Diane." A pause. "I didn't know," Diane said, "that it would—" She stopped, started again. "I knew what Margaret planned. I didn't say anything." Elena looked at her sister. Diane was 34 years old and had the face of someone who was currently understanding something about herself that she hadn't understood before tonight. Elena knew this face. She had worn versions of it herself. "I know," Elena said. "That's worse, isn't it?" Diane said. It was not quite a question. "A little," Elena said honestly. Across the room, Margaret was watching them. Her expression was composed. Margaret's expressions were always composed in public. But something in her posture had changed. The slight tension of someone who is maintaining a position that has become more effortful than expected. And then Margaret began walking toward them, and the distance between them was closing, and Elena felt the gathering of something that was not quite a confrontation, and not quite a reckoning, but contained elements of both. The night had not finished with them yet. Margaret arrived at a pace that was deliberately unhurried. "That went well," she said, and her voice carried the warmth that Elena had grown up understanding was different from warmth. Carter seemed interested. "He asked for her contact," Diane said. There was something in Diane's voice Elena hadn't heard before. Not defense, exactly. Correction. The small, brave act of correcting the record in front of someone you usually defer to. Margaret looked at Diane. A silent economy of information passed between them that Elena was fluent in from a lifetime of watching it. "That's wonderful," Margaret said, redirecting toward Elena with perfect smoothness. "I'm so glad it worked out. Sometimes these things find a way." Elena regarded her older sister. Margaret was 36 and had spent their shared life arranging things so that Elena's presence in a room was useful to Margaret's purposes without ever being a threat to them. She did this without malice. Or almost without malice. She did it the way people do things that they have never had to examine, because the things have always worked. Elena knew this too, had known it for years, had made a private accommodation to it the way you make accommodations to structural things that you can't easily change. "The presentation slot," Elena said. "That wasn't filled by other presenters." Margaret's expression held. It was tight. "It wasn't there," Elena said. "That's all right. I'm saying so you know that I know. Not as an accusation." She paused. "As a fact." The silence that followed was one of the more interesting silences Elena had stood in recently. "Elena," Margaret began. "Carter Hartwell will call next week," Elena said. "If he does, I'll handle it myself. If he doesn't, I'll handle that myself too." She held her sister's gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who has reached the end of a long patience and has found, on the other side of it, something that is not anger, but might be something more permanent. "You don't need to manage this one." She picked up her coat from the chair beside her and said goodnight to Diane, who received it with an expression that was mostly honest for the first time all evening. She did not say goodnight to Margaret. She was near the exit when she heard footsteps behind her, and this time she knew them from the length and pace, which told her something she didn't stop to analyze. "I'll walk out with you," Daniel said, "if that's all right." It was all right. The lobby of the West Loop building was quieter than the event floor had been, with the particular quality of quiet that exists in spaces designed for transition. Marble floors, a security desk with a man whose name tag said Kevin, who was reading something on his phone, and looked up briefly when they emerged from the elevator. Outside, Chicago in October was doing what Chicago in October does. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since Elena had arrived, and the wind off the lake had found its angle. She put her coat on, which required briefly holding the portfolio under her arm at a precarious angle, and Daniel took the portfolio without being asked, and held it while she put the coat on, and handed it back after, and this small transfer happened with the ease of people who have known each other longer than they have. She noticed this. She did not comment on it. They stood on the sidewalk. The street was still active. This neighborhood was always active at this hour. Cabs moving east, a group of people outside the restaurant 2 doors down, music just audible from somewhere above them. "The folder," Elena said. "The presentation folder that landed on the table." He waited. "The charcoal blazer woman. That was you announcing me, wasn't it? Setting the portfolio down." "I set it down to open it," he said. "Carter needed to see it flat." "But you put it there first. The sound of it." A beat. Something in his expression, that quality of attention again, but different now, turned inward for a moment, as if he was being honest with himself about something before deciding how honest to be allowed. "I wanted his attention on the table before I made the introduction," he said. "So the work landed before the name did." "Not the name, the context." "Yes." Elena was quiet for a moment, working through the geometry of what he had done. The quiet management of a moment, the understanding that presentation is as much about sequence as it is about content, that the right information in the wrong order doesn't land the same way. It was the same logic as the light notch. 40 square feet, invisibly, in the right place, at the right time. "That was a risk," she said. "You didn't know if Carter would respond." "I knew the work was good," he said. "The risk was whether good was what Carter needed to hear tonight. But I thought—" He paused, not uncertain, looking for the right language. "I thought the room needed one thing that night that wasn't performing at anyone." Elena looked at him. The light from the building entrance caught the side of his face, at an angle that made his expression very readable. Or perhaps it was simply that she had been reading him all evening and had learned the register. "You saw the presentation slot," she said. "I heard you tell Margaret you knew." He paused. "I also heard the way you said it, like it was a fact about geography." "It was." "Most people," he said, "would have been angrier, or sadder, in ways that would have been visible. Being visible about it wouldn't have changed it." "No," he said, "but it might have made the rest of the evening easier. To feel it where it could be seen." This was an unexpected observation. Elena turned it over. "It's a habit," she said finally. "From years of—" She stopped, started again. "My sisters are not bad people. They're people who are afraid of being left behind. That fear makes them do things that look like cruelty, but are actually just—" She paused. "Fear trying to stay ahead of the thing it's afraid of." Daniel was quiet. "That doesn't make it not cruel," Elena added. "I know that too." "But it means you came here anyway," he said. "Not because you forgive it, because you have work you believe in, and you weren't going to let their fear decide where you showed it." Elena felt something in her chest adjust, the particular sensation of having a thing that has been inside you named from the outside, accurately, by someone who did not have to make the effort to name it. "Yes," she said simply. The wind picked up off the lake, the kind of gust that finds the gap between buildings and accelerates through it. Elena's coat was heavy enough for October, but not warm enough for this particular gust, and she felt the cold for a second before it passed. "The Indianapolis project," Daniel said. "The one with the window problem on the south facade." He had put his hands in his pockets, which was probably a response to the wind. "Carter funded it in concept, before the exterior was solved. He regrets the south elevation. He said so twice, which from Carter means he thinks about it often." Elena waited. He will call next week, Daniel said. I want to be clear that I'm not certain of that. Carter is deliberate and not entirely predictable even to me. But the things he asked you tonight, the rough sketches, the 40 square feet, the reason for the height, those were not polite questions. They were the questions he asks when he's trying to understand whether someone knows what they're doing. And I think he thinks you do. She stood with this. You think, she said. You're not sure. I'm never sure of Carter until he does the thing. A pause. But I'm sure of the work. The restaurant group down the street had grown louder. Someone was celebrating something. One of those spontaneous celebrations that Chicago sidewalks in October occasionally produce. Elena glanced toward them briefly and back. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Not suspicious, genuinely curious. The question of motive had been with her all evening, and she had been holding it, letting it be unanswered, because some things answer themselves if you give them enough time, and others you have to simply ask. Daniel looked at her. In the light from the building entrance, in the October wind, with the city moving around them in its enormous, unconnected way, his expression was the most unguarded it had been all night. Because, he said, and then paused for a moment that was not uncertainty, but was something else. The pause of someone choosing language very carefully. I have spent a professional life in rooms like the one we were just in. And most of what happens in those rooms is people trying to be seen without being willing to be known. And tonight, I watched someone do everything opposite to that, without intending to, because that is simply what she is. And I wanted to say so before we got in our separate cabs. Elena held this. It was a long moment. That is a very specific compliment, she said. I'm a specific person, he said. Something unguarded moved through her face. She felt it happen, which was unusual. The unguarded things usually arrived and departed, without her registering them consciously. The Norwood light logic, she said. The floor that borrows from the ones above and below it. She looked at the building across the street. Not the Hartwell venue anymore, just a building, existing in its Chicago way in October light. I've been sitting on it for 18 months because finishing it felt like letting it be judged. And now? And now I think I've been protecting it from something it doesn't actually need protecting from. She said this slowly, as if the understanding was arriving as she spoke it rather than before. Or protecting yourself, he said. Or that. A cab appeared at the end of the block, its light on. Neither of them moved to flag it. The thing I haven't solved yet, she said. The reason for the height. The function that earns the upper floors from the perspective of the ground. She paused. I think I know what it is. I've been afraid to commit to it because it changes the exterior logic fundamentally, and I'd have to revise the first 6 months of work. What is it? She told him. It took about 4 minutes to explain, standing on a Chicago sidewalk in October, using her hands when the language wasn't precise enough. He listened with the quality of attention she had been recognizing all evening. Complete, still, not filling the air while she used it. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. That's good, he said. That's actually what the building has been trying to be the whole time. I know, she said. That's why it took 18 months to see it. The second cab came down the block. This one she flagged. While she waited for it to pull to the curb, she turned and looked at him directly, with the fullness of attention she usually reserved for spaces she was trying to understand, before deciding whether they were worth her time. Thank you, she said. Not for the portfolio introduction, not for walking out, not for anything specific. For all of it, and for none of it, and for the version of the evening that had happened because of and in spite of everything. He looked back at her with the expression she had been learning all night. "The foundation will call next week," he said. "If they don't, I will." The cab was at the curb. She got in. Through the window, as the cab pulled away, she saw him standing on the sidewalk. He wasn't watching the cab. He was already looking up at the building across the street, looking at it with that quality of attention, the architectural attention, the kind that reads a structure for what it is rather than what it claims to be. She looked away and let the city move around her. The foundation called on Wednesday. Not next week. Wednesday, 4 days after the Hartwell event. Elena was at her drafting table when the call came, which was where she was most mornings, but that morning with a difference. She had been working since 6 a.m. on the revision she had not admitted to herself she was going to make until she told Daniel about it on a sidewalk and heard herself say it aloud. The upper floor logic. The reason for the height. She had been inside it for 3 days straight, not frantically, but with the specific focused energy that arrives when you have stopped protecting something and started finishing it. The call was from a woman named Andrea from the Hartwell Foundation, efficient and warm in the manner of people who have arranged many things and are good at arranging them. "Mr. Hartwell would like to schedule a formal presentation," Andrea said. "He has availability next Friday or the following Monday." "Friday," Elena said. She spent the next 9 days working, not to the exclusion of everything else. She had other projects, other obligations, but with the Norwood concepts as the primary thing, the thing she returned to at the end of each day and picked up first at the beginning of the next. The upper floor revision changed more than she had anticipated and less than she had feared, which is typically how the right revision works. She had to rebuild the exterior logic from the 3rd floor upward. She had to reconceive the community function. She had to go back into the light study and check whether the new configuration changed the seasonal behavior in ways that affected the 2nd floor notch. It didn't. The light logic held. She finished the exterior concept on Thursday night at 11:20. She stood back from the drafting table and looked at it for a long time. The building in the drawings was not the building she had imagined 18 months ago, which was good. It was better than what she had imagined, which meant the work had taken her somewhere she could not have reached by protecting it. She photographed the drawings, uploaded them, and went to sleep. The Hartwell Foundation offices were in the Merchandise Mart, which was a building Elena had always loved for reasons she found difficult to separate from the objective and the personal. She arrived at 9:50 for a 10 o'clock meeting and spent the 10 minutes in the lobby looking at the ceiling, which was a thing she did in great buildings. Not admiring exactly, more confirming, checking whether what she knew about a space from the outside was what it was on the inside. Carter Hartwell was in the meeting room, along with 2 members of his foundation team, and, at the far end of the table, Daniel. She had not known Daniel would be there. She adjusted for this information without registering it externally, which was the kind of adjustment she made easily by now, taking in a new piece of information about a room and incorporating it without disrupting the surface. Daniel looked up from something he was reading when she came in. Their eyes met briefly, and then she turned toward Carter and began setting up. The presentation was different from the evening at the Hartwell launch. Everything was complete now. The full concept, the exterior resolution, the light logic with the updated floor configurations, the revised revenue projection that took into account the upper floor function. She had also included the data set she had referenced in the conversation with Carter about the occupancy analogs properly cited. She presented it the way she thought through things, from the idea forward, not from the conclusion backward. She started with the problem she was trying to solve, the way vertical residential development in urban neighborhoods consistently failed to integrate with the fabric of the neighborhood it entered, creating additions rather than continuations, and moved toward the solution she had arrived at, showing the work along the way, including the things she had tried and rejected, including the rough sketches Carter had asked to see the other night. She spoke for 45 minutes. Carter asked 12 questions. His team asked 7 more. Daniel asked 2, both very specific, both about things she would have asked about too if she had been on the other side of the table. She answered every question. When it was over, Carter Hartwell leaned back in his chair and looked at the final drawing, the completed exterior, the building that had finally agreed to be what it was. For a long moment. "The south facade," he said. He did not say what building he meant. "It doesn't apologize," Elena said. He looked at her. Something in his expression was deliberate and decided, and she recognized it now. She had seen it the other night when the conversation had shifted from assessment to something adjacent to commitment. "We'd like to fund the Norwood project through the design development phase," he said. "Full structural consultation from month 3. 1 completed building from the portfolio for your comparative occupancy data. We have one in Indianapolis that's 3 years into occupancy." She remained still for a moment, not because she needed to think about the answer, because some things deserve the space of a moment rather than the reflex of immediacy. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." The meeting ended. Carter's team collected materials and filed out in the practiced way of people who attend many meetings. Carter shook her hand with the warmth she now understood was genuine in him. Even when it was also practiced, it was possible for warmth to be both. "Next steps through Andrea," he said. "But I want the exterior logic locked before the structural phase. That's the thing you solved. Don't move it." "I won't," she said. He left. She was alone in the meeting room with Daniel, which was the kind of thing that either happens or doesn't, and she had not arranged for it to happen. She was putting the drawings back into the portfolio when he said, "The upper floor function." "The community library," she said, without looking up. "With the view. A library earns height," she said. "It justifies being above the street level in a way residents can feel from below. The people who live in it and the people who only see it from outside both have a reason for it to be there. And the south facade doesn't apologize. The south facade is what it is." She finished with the drawings and closed the portfolio. When she looked up, he was standing at the window. Not quite the same quality of attention as the model display at the Hartwell event, but close, looking at the building across the Merchandise Mart corridor. "The Indianapolis project," she said. "The 3 years of occupancy data." "Ruth can connect you with the property management team," he said. "She's foundation side. She'll be useful." "She already was," Elena said. He turned from the window. The October light was different from Friday night. Morning light, direct rather than reflected. No warmth in it, but good for seeing clearly. "I have a lunch in an hour," he said. "If you don't have somewhere to be immediately, there's a good coffee in this building." Elena considered this. She had a call at 2 and a meeting at 4, and work she could be doing in every available hour between now and both of those things. She had a project that was now funded, and a building to finish designing, and 18 months of work that was finally allowed to be what it was. She also had, right now, an October morning in a building she loved, and a cup of coffee, and an hour in which nothing needed to be performed. "I have an hour," she said. They walked out of the meeting room together into the broad, warm, vaulted corridor of the Merchandise Mart, and Elena looked up at the ceiling again, confirming what she knew, finding it still true. And Daniel watched her do it. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I already know what it is. I just like to check." He understood this. She could see that he did. And she did not need him to say so, which was perhaps the simplest and most honest version of the thing she had discovered about him over the course of a strange, complicated, improbable week. That understanding could exist between people without requiring either of them to explain it. They walked south through the building toward the coffee, and the city continued outside the enormous windows, going about its enormous continuous life, indifferent and extraordinary, and entirely unaware that something small and real and worth something had found its shape here, today, in October, with the lake invisible somewhere to the east, and the light falling at exactly the angle that made the floors worth looking at. 3 weeks later, a thin crack appeared in the threshold strip between the tile sections on the main floor of the renovated West Loop venue. The facilities report noted that the issue had been flagged at the Hartwell Foundation event and should have been addressed then. Ruth Okafor, who had submitted the original flag, sent a follow-up email to the property management company. It was repaired that afternoon. What stays with me is the portfolio under Elena's arm. The thing she almost didn't bring, the work she'd spent 18 months protecting from being seen. She carried it through a room that had been arranged specifically so it wouldn't matter. And it was the only thing in that room that night that no one had staged. Here's what I keep turning over. The moment Carter asked to see the rough sketches. Not the finished work. The ones that existed to think rather than to show. What does it mean that the unfinished version of something is sometimes the more honest way in? If this one landed for you, drop a comment with the thing you've been protecting from being seen. I'd genuinely like to know.